But those four guys, they got along famously. Just had a wonderful friendship, and the four of them got in my dad's, I think it was an old Model T, about a 1918 Model T, I think it was. And they drove down from northern Michigan, right around East Jordan. They moved down to Detroit. They were all looking for work. Work was scarce up in northern Michigan at that time. This was in 1925. And so Kenny would have been a year old, and I was 2 years old, or 3 years old rather. And but they came down, and it took them, if I understood the story right, it took them 3 days. There were hardly any roads that we didn't know of now. There was no freeways. They would just all young fellows in their early 30s, and they'd say, well, there's a field that looks pretty solid, but quite often they would get stuck in the field, and so they'd jump out, and they took turns driving, the four of them. Whoever was driving stayed in the car, and the other three out, and they would get long poles and put behind the rear axle to push it out, and they'd be laughing. Dad said we'd fall down and get muddy. He said we didn't care. He said we just jump in the car and away we'd go. He said we'd go maybe 10 or 15 miles and have a flat tire and fix a tire. And he said we just made a big game of it. And he said we got down here and all four of us got jobs, and all four of them are good workers. So they got jobs and found homes and went back to East Jordan and picked up their families, and we all came down. I don't remember that trip at all. I was only 3 years old, but I should have. It seemed like I would have remembered it. But there were 6 kids at that time, including Kenny's the youngest. Kenny would have been a year old, and I was 3 years old. Beta would have been 8. Louis would have been 11. Howard was 13, and Floyd was 14. So we must have taken 2 trips. I can't remember how we did it because we couldn't have all gotten one car, 8 of us. But we stayed for a better part of a year with my Uncle Dewey, my mother's younger brother, and his wife. Her name was Icy, a beautiful lady. And she had a daughter, I don't think her daughter was born yet when we lived there with them. Her name was Melva. And she turned out to be a beautiful lady. But anyway, we lived there for a year or so, and then we moved just north a couple miles to Hazel Park. And so that's where we lived. And we lived there for a year, well, just a few months, and Keith and Keith were born in November 23rd of 1926. And that was quite an event, having twins born, and my mother wasn't expecting twins. And so I'd already told the story, I believe, about their birth. And, but that leads you up to it. So then we lived in Hazel Park many years. All of us kids went through school at Hazel Park. At one time or another, not all at the same time, of course, but Pete Scott figured out that we had 72 relatives who went through Hazel Park High School. Went through the school system. At least they went to some of the schools at one time or another. Some of them didn't graduate. They moved on to another town and finished school at other towns. But at one time or another, there were 72 kids. And there were about 20 of us that played football at Hazel Park High School. And several of us were captains. I think 4 or 5 of us. 2 of us brothers were, Louis and I were brothers of the football teams. But I know Virgil was, and Carl Hill was, and I'm not sure about Topper Scott. But I tell you about the ones that all came down, the 4 of them together came down to get jobs. Uncle Harrison and Aunt Pearl settled in Hazel Park, and they had 7 daughters. And Aunt Beatrice, we always called her Aunt B, she had 4 boys, Pete, Verge, Bun, and Bull. Actually, their names was Valoris, Virgil, Verdon, and Verlin. Then they had a daughter later, a younger sister of these boys. She was married, born several years later, 1931. Her name is Thelma. She's still living down in Hazel Park. And Virgil's still living. He's the only boy living. He lives in Lakeland, Florida. But he turned out to be he was in Patton's army in Europe, and he was wounded in the back quite severely. And he just recently had back surgery just in the past several months. but he told me he's lost quite a bit of his height. He used to be about 6'1", now he's about 5'9". Had his back upward on 2 or 3 times. But he was in Patton's army in Europe, and I believe he retired as when he was discharged. I think he was a major in the service. And Bun went in the submarines. I told you that, I believe, and Bull was an infantryman in South Pacific, the 6th Division. I think I told about Floyd, didn't I? About him being in the service. He was in the Navy in the South Pacific. He was a radio operator in the Naval Air Force.
Didn't they take Keith out of high school?
Oh yeah, Keith, I had been wounded in July of 1944, and in April of 1945, Floyd and I were still in the service, and Keith was ready to graduate from high school, and this was 1945, June of 1945. But in April they drafted him right out of high school, and I was really upset about that, and so was my folks, because we at least figured he could finish school 2 more months, or a month and a half. But they took 7 of those boys out of that class, and I knew all of the young fellows they took. And but Keith didn't resent it at all, and he wasn't as upset as I was. But he went in the medics and was transferred over to Korea. This was before the Korea conflict, so there wasn't any war going on there, so he was safe. But he said that was the best thing that happened to him, but it could have happened because he said, I learned to get along more on my own. He said, I matured, and he said, I learned a lot of things in the service that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So he said it didn't turn out to be a bad deal for him. But boy, we were upset. We thought the least they could do is let him graduate. He did well though, but he didn't marry until I think he was 28 years old. And so we had most of our children by the time he was born, or by the time he was married rather. And I think he was married in 1954, so we had all 4 of our children by then. But he had Jimmy in I think 1955, and I think Brian was probably 1957 or 58. And but all in all, I think we had a wonderful family. I look back and I just love all the brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews, all of us brother-in-law and sisters-in-law. They were all good to me. Good family. We always visited back and forth and had great times. We had so many good cousins. Growing up in a town full of cousins is amazing. I couldn't go anywhere without seeing a cousin.